I went to a special town meeting recently where there was a lot of talk about affordable housing and zoning, and spoke with some colleagues or friends of mine afterwards, and we thought, brought to mind Thomas Jefferson, education is the cornerstone of democracy, and thought, hey, we've got to educate ourselves. We're swimming through this sea of alphabet soup. There's a lot of misinformation, and let's educate ourselves as to what are the terms, what are the ABCs of affordable housing. And so looking around town, we saw that Harbor Light is a company that our town is trusted to build affordable housing right next door at the high school and at Pigeon Cove Ledges and now at the Granite Street crossing. So we invited Rosa Ordaz, who's the community education person from there, to come and introduce us to the terms and what does this mean? What do we need to do or not need to do, and basically educate us. And so I certainly am not an expert in affordable housing and really welcome to learn as much as possible. She's prepared some slides for us this morning, and she will speak for 45 minutes. And the idea, again, is to present terms, to understand how to talk about this. And then this is not a debate. We're not going to put forward points of view. We're not pushing anything. We're just trying to educate ourselves. And so we did include at the table outside, there's a glossary of terms, which you can all pick up. And there's also index cards. So after the 45 minutes, and I do want to respect everybody's time, and thank you for surrendering a Saturday to educate yourselves on this topic. And after the 45 minutes, we'll have 30 minutes of questions and answers. And so we'll limit each person with a question to 3 minutes. And Ms. Ordaz will do the best she can to answer it. And we'll go back and forth. We have some people on Zoom. We have a nice room full here in the Rockport Public Library. We're very grateful for this space. And so then afterwards, when you leave, there's an opportunity to sign in if you want to continue the conversation. We do have another session planned for the 11th of March where there'll be a panel and some more back and forth. But it just seems really critical for us to educate ourselves and decide what path are we going to take as a town, come up with a solution together. So the first step is let's educate ourselves. This meeting is recorded on Zoom, and it's recorded for 1623, thanks to the folks who are facilitating that. And without further ado, I forgot the most important thing. In the back of the room, the restrooms there to the left, so if anybody needs those. And so Ms. Ordaz will walk us through the ABCs of affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Rosa Ordaz. I'm with Harbor Light Community Partners, and I just want to preface by adding to what Laura said, that I don't think anyone's ever an expert in affordable housing. There are so many things that change and pop up all the time, as does local policy and zoning. So I'm happy to be here with you all. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday to be here. I'm going to talk about affordable housing in kind of a general sense. The glossary that you might have picked up is very long, but I hope is a little bit helpful and thorough with what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. So I do want to also add that I know that there are a lot of zoning amendments and changes coming from the state level and also locally in Rockport and a lot of other municipalities. So today, what we're hoping to accomplish is to talk about what affordable housing is, some about like local policy and how they kind of interact with each other, and a little bit about some of the initiatives that might be in front of you now or, town meeting. I know I've already heard around the room, I've heard a lot about ADUs, so I'm happy to talk about that also more in the Q&A time, because there's not a ton of slides about ADUs here, but I'm happy to also go into that. So we can get started. I just checked time, okay. All right, so like I said, my name is Rosa. I'm with Harbor Light Homes. We are a nonprofit developer. You might know us here in Rockport from our senior housing, Pigeon Cove Ledges, and Rockport High School Apartments, and more recently, Granite Street Crossing. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by affordable housing? You know, a lot of the times when we're out having conversations, you know, a lot of the things that we hear is like, well, who is this housing affordable for? You know, this doesn't reflect the income of our community. And so for the purpose of today, I just kind of want to define what I mean by affordable housing. You can go to the next slide, please. So we're going to go over the definition and what AMI is. Some of you might be already familiar with it, and if you're not, feel free to ask me to clarify. Next slide. So generally speaking, affordable housing is when the cost of housing is 30% of a household's income. That is the definition that is used and determined by HUD, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But basically, that figure means that a family or a person should have enough after they've paid for their housing cost for things like food and transportation and other things that they might want to spend their money on. Subsidized housing, which is you know, what you might know as affordable housing, is what this means. So when we're talking about affordable housing or subsidized housing, it meets the criteria generally for the incomes that we're about to see. Next slide. So area median income, or AMI, this is something that we see everywhere, right? When we're listening to planning board meetings or when we're looking at applications for housing, we see all these AMI limits. So one thing that I just like to reiterate is that these are determined by HUD. And there's nothing we can do at a municipality level to change what those are, legally speaking. Rockport is included in the Boston, Cambridge, Quincy metropolitan area. That's a huge region, very different for a lot of different communities. But that's what AMI means for Rockport. So the next slide, you'll see what that looks like. Can you guys see those numbers okay? It's a lot of text. No?
Really.
I don't know if we can zoom in anymore.
Slides if you put your email address.
Yeah. So I can read them. I can read it, but
Don't, please.
no, I'm not gonna read the whole thing. Don't worry. So just, you know, generally speaking, to qualify for an affordable home, to qualify to be registered for a SHI, which we'll get into later, meaning it counts with the state, right? I don't know why I did quotes, because that is actually what it means. It counts as far as the state's concerned that it's a subsidized home that's affordable. The measurement for that is 80% AMI or below. So 80% here for a family of 4 is $111,850 a year. So that's what's considered 80% or below would be what's allowable to be registered with the state. I'm just gonna leave that number there. I'm not gonna go into the rest. Okay, next. So housing related committees and boards and some policies. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what you have here in Rockport and some other things that are coming down the pipeline and what it might mean or what you might see. The next slide. So here we've got Rockport's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. The town adopted it in April of 2017. My understanding is there's not a board of trustees that's been appointed yet. Is that correct?
That's correct. People are invited to submit their resumes if they're interested to the Board of Selectmen who are accepting candidates.
Yep. So thank you. So we'll get into that a little bit later. And the second big thing you have in Rockport is the Community Preservation Act Committee, or CPA, of Rockport, and that was adopted by the town in 2002. So both of these things went to town meeting and passed. Next slide. So the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, or the RAHTF, which is not fun to say. So I'm just going to say trust fund, Housing Trust Fund. So this is kind of like hypothetical, but also not, because there are statutes that they have to follow, but also because it hasn't been fully operational yet in Rockport. Some of these things might apply and some of them might not. So generally speaking, it would support the creation or preservation of housing that does not exceed 110% of AMI. So thinking back to that big slide that we saw of numbers, it would be way down at 110. So can anybody guess what 110 means? 110%, there goes my name tag, see? Yeah, I can't ever get these to stay.
110% of the 80%?
No,
110 was
the
the income.
of the area median income of that Boston, Quincy, Rockport. So that means that it can be above 100% of AMI. So like market rate or slightly above market rate. Which is interesting, right? Not what you think about. So what can the Affordable Housing Trust do? It can collect funds for affordable housing by segregating them out of the general municipal budget and put it in a trust fund where it can only be used for very specific things surrounding housing. The Massachusetts General Law, if you're curious, is here. So it's Chapter 44, Section 55C. Your Rockport Affordable Housing Trust would have all of the powers described in that general law, but Rockport has a couple things that they've added. Some actions will require pre-approval of the Board of Selectmen, and some of them would have to go to town meeting and pass by 2/3 of a vote. The only thing that I saw that would go to town meeting would be any borrowing done by the trust. And again, it's not fully operating yet, so this is just what I saw. So it will function as a branch of your local government. It will meet at least quarterly according to the website, and it will appoint a board of trustees. And in Rockport, you will have 9. The minimum at the state statute is 5. They must all be Rockport residents, and then there's specific, there has to be a person from, I think, like the planning board. There has to be 5 residents, a couple other specific. Select board. Next slide. So this is what's allowable because, again, Rockport is not fully operating yet. Where does the money come from? So it can come from Community Preservation Act funds, which we'll get into because it's very common to fund an affordable housing trust fund out of the CPA, but you have to follow rules and regulations, and that money has to be tracked separately because they're 2 different statutes in the municipal general law. It can come from inclusionary zoning payments, which Rockport does not have, negotiated developer fees, general fund, tax title sales, a bunch of different ways, but the CPA funding is very common. Next slide. So what can it do and who is eligible to apply for funds? It can be used for permanent or transitional housing for homeless families, affordable, market rate. You can use it to rehab or repair housing authority properties. You can provide financial support for developers, nonprofit or for-profit, in building housing. You can also provide rental assistance to low-income families if needed. You can increase the affordability level in new construction of housing developments. And you can use it to develop surplus municipal buildings and a couple other things. So it'll all depend on, the bylaws that Rockport adopts. Next. And they might already be adopted. So this is kind of the sequence, and I skipped a lot of what happens before town meeting because it's a lot of work for the municipal staff. So, they went to town meeting. It passed by simple majority. The bylaws get submitted to the Attorney General within 30 days after the vote. The Attorney General by law has to provide a response within 90 days. After that, this is where Rockport is, right? You would establish a board of trustees, so 9 in Rockport, appointed by the Board of Selectmen. It's a good idea and recommended to submit a declaration of the trust to the Registry of Deeds. Not required, but it's recommended. And after that, you can do a creation of the trust fund account, right? So depositing money for it. You can draft an action plan, so what the Housing Trust in Rockport wants to do. You can secure funding. You can put out requests for proposals if there is, like, for example, a building that's owned by the town that they want developed. and they can start meeting. Okay, next slide. So the Community Preservation Act, or CPA, Committee of Rockport, it is part of a larger state entity that's called the Community Preservation Coalition. That is, I'm trying to remember what year it passed, and I want to say 2000 maybe? So the CPA helps communities preserve three things: open space, historic, and affordable housing. The creation or preservation of affordable housing. So think about it as like three buckets. When the money comes in, you deposit money into each of those buckets, and those have to be used for those individual buckets. So you can't take money from historic and move it to housing and vice versa. So Rockport's CPA funds come from two things. So Rockport has implemented a local CPA surcharge, which is very common. It's 3%, but it does not mean that the tax rate increases. So I'll give you an example of what that means in the next slide. Rockport has also adopted an exemption that subtracts the first 100,000 of the home property, the home property, and it's exempt from that surcharge. So that lowers the amount. The second way that the funds come through Rockport is through the receipt of annual matching funds. So that's that statewide CPC. That number is variable depending on how many communities have adopted the CPA, how many are participating, so how much money is kind of in that bigger pool, and that gets dispersed. Next slide. So here's the example. These are very low numbers, but I picked very easy numbers so that we were all on the same page, because math is not my super strong suit. So the assessed value of a home is $300,000. So you subtract that $100,000 exemption that Rockport has in place. That leaves you with $200,000 that's taxable. Tax rate of 10% means it's $2,000, right? 3% of that $2,000, $60. That's what goes into the CPA trust fund. So it sounds like it's really high at first when you see it, but it's really not that high. Next slide. So here's those three buckets that we talked about. These are sometimes lumped together, open space and recreation. There they're separated, not really sure why. So CPA can fund projects up to 100%. So the Affordable Housing Trust can go higher than CPA. But remember, you need to be at 80% to have it count for the state if it's an affordable property. It can fund projects developed by for-profit or nonprofit organizations, among other people that we talked about, groups, and it can fund a variety of housing types. So with housing in particular, you can acquire, create, preserve, or support affordable housing, but you cannot use the funds to rehab or restore unless that property was created with CPA money from the very beginning. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are two things that are proposed that are coming in the future to Rockport. So we've got the MBTA multifamily districts. I'm just curious how many of you have heard of that and are familiar with it? Yeah, it's a big one. And the second is TOD, or in Rockport's case, TOVD, Transit-Oriented Village District. Next slide. I could spend 5 hours on just MBTA, so we're going to try to condense this very briefly, and I'm happy to come back and do just an MBTA one if people want it. So it's a new Massachusetts law that applies to every single community that's designated as an MBTA community. There are 4 different designations. There's a commuter rail, which is what Rockport is. There's an adjacent town, adjacent small town, and I'm blanking on the 4th one right now. That'll come to me. That's rapid transit. Thank you. Yes, I blame the baby. I have a baby. I blame her for everything. It's great. So basically what it says is that all of these communities have different responsibilities. We're just going to talk about commuter rails because that's what Rockport is. Rockport's responsibility is to zone for an area that allows multifamily development by right. So that means no special permits. That means no age-restricted housing. That means no limitations on like home size. So like you can't build studios only, for example, because it's not suitable for children to live in that specific layout. And it has to be within a half a mile of the station. So this does not require anyone to build affordable housing, but it offers an opportunity for communities to say, we're going to allow affordable housing to be built in this area by offering, I'm just making this up, offering a financial incentive or by guaranteeing, whatever, expedited process. Or you can, I actually don't even know if you can legally do that, so I take that back. But it'd be great if you could. Or you can also require it. So you can require with an overlay district that 10%, which is what the state requires anyway, of new development is affordable. You can do multiple things, but the MBTA law in itself does not require any community to build affordable housing within that MBTA district. So what happens if Rockport does not meet those requirements? Rockport and any community that does not meet those requirements is at risk of losing some pretty significant state-level funding. It includes the MassWorks program, the Housing Choice Initiative, or the Local Capital Projects Fund. Next slide. So TOD, this is in a general sense kind of where the TOVD that Rockport has implemented comes from. So it's a smart growth tool that Massachusetts recommends for communities that want to increase their housing production. It creates mixed-use, higher-density communities in a specific place that encourages people to live and work and shop and eat in places close to where they live. So hopefully decreasing the reliance on cars and creating more walkable, pedestrian-friendly cities or towns or areas. So it's typically characterized by moderate to high density, a lot of thought into bike lanes and pedestrian-friendly sidewalks, accessible sidewalks, reduced parking, because you're hoping people are not relying on cars. And it usually occurs like a 5 to 7 minute walk from the station or like the downtown area. And there's some grants that are available if municipalities want to follow this. So Rockport's, next slide, the TOVD is made up of 12.3 acres, and it has the potential to have up to 160 multifamily homes built within that area. So this overlay, I read over Rockport's action plan for the MBTA submitted by Jason Shaw, and it's proposed as a tool for Rockport to achieve compliance with the MBTA law. It's adjacent to the MBTA commuter station here in Rockport. I do want to mention that the town is not progressing because they're still waiting for the AG's decision on the petition that was filed on September 1st. So it hasn't, I don't think it's progressed since then. Am I correct on that?
I don't know.
Okay.
Does anybody else know?
That's all I could find.
Okay.
So, okay.
Thank you.
I thought it went through. Not sure.
Well, it was adopted, but it didn't like finalize. Yeah. So next slide. So how are we doing on time? You doing okay?
Yeah, you're doing well. Thank you.
Okay. So other housing related policies, these are not related to Rockport, but I think we can touch on them since we're doing okay. So you have these other two types of zoning that are also encouraging to increasing housing. So you have inclusionary zoning, which requires a percentage of units in any development to be set aside for homes earning less than the median income. So you can decide what that looks like. You can decide locally what percent is required at what level. So, for example, you could decide that 10% of all new developments have to be offered at 80% AMI, which was that 111 figure that we talked about earlier for a family of 4. Or you could decide that 15% or 20%, which is really high, have to be developed at 80% or 60%. I would say probably the most common is the 10%, but we've seen some communities going above that recently. So it's encouraging, but we'll see how that works out. Hopefully really well. Incentive zoning is voluntary, but what communities can do is it can offer density bonuses or other things to encourage developers to include affordable housing in developments. So they could opt not to include any affordable apartments within the development and not take advantage of any of those incentives, and it would still be fine. Next slide, please. So these two both are connected to Rockport. So the overlay districts, like the TOVD that we just talked about, is a zoning that lies on top of existing zoning. And what it does is it gives the community an opportunity to meet the needs of that specific area. So if you have, for example, let's just say mixed use zoning in an area, and then you want to lay down, that's a really bad example. Let's go with R2. So 2 families by right, and you want to lay down the TOVD that Rockport's proposed, it would allow somebody to build more than just a 2-family by right. Does that make sense? So 40R, also proposed in Rockport's MBTA action plan as part of the MBTA compliance piece. It encourages communities to create dense residential or mixed use smart growth areas, including a high percentage of affordable housing developments within that area near a transit station or downtown or somewhere where people would typically want to spend their time. Next slide. Other housing related options. I know there's been some discussion in Rockport about land banks and land trusts. So I will tell you this is not my area of expertise, but I can tell you what it is. So land banks are public entities, usually public, nonprofit, or government, specializing in the conversion of vacant, abandoned, or foreclosed properties. They respond to state legislation. They don't respond to local legislation other than the zoning, perhaps, in certain cases, the way that like the Affordable Housing Trust does. They're separate. So this is a separate group from local government. The great part about land banks, though, is their existence and the way that it's structured at the state level does allow them to remove a lot of legal and financial barriers that often slow down other developers, such as like delinquent property taxes, right? So like if I'm a private buyer and I buy something that has delinquent property tax on it, it's my responsibility. A land bank might be able to go around that and proceed with development. Community land trust is traditionally private nonprofits that hold land in a trust for the purpose of developing it into permanently affordable housing. So it's usually very long terms before the housing statute expires or permanent. Both of these are great mechanisms for taking control of land or property that might be problematic for other groups. Next slide. Chapter 40B, somebody was talking to me about this. Maureen, I think, mentioned it earlier. So what is Chapter 40B? Before we go to the next slide, who can tell me what it is?
Affordable housing.
Affordable housing, yep. It's responsible for the majority of affordable housing in the state.
Overruling the town zoning, and the Board of Appeals issues a permit, a comprehensive permit.
There you go.
Taking in all the state's permits and the town ones.
Yeah, really close.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think the town
okay.
hasn't met its obligation of the 10%.
Yes, that's
and
the other piece.
developer can-
That is the other piece.
We didn't hear that.
Oh, she said, what was her name?
Nancy.
Nancy. So Nancy said, oh, hi Nancy, said that it's applicable when a town or a city has not met the required 10% of affordable housing. So let's talk about what it is. But all of those things are correct. So it's a state statute. It gives the ZBA powers to issue a comprehensive permit to a developer that is able to expedite the development process by bypassing local zoning. The caveat there is affordable housing is required, right? So it's kind of like a lever. If a town is under the 10%, a developer can help them get to 10% by circumventing some of the zoning that might prevent the town from getting to that 10%. So it's really complicated, but I will say, like I said earlier, it is responsible for the majority of affordable housing that's been developed in the Commonwealth. So out of 700,000 total units, it makes up for 35,000 of them. So I think this is important also to mention that it does not allow developers to override the state. So I think that's what you were saying, is they go by the state level statutes and regulations, but they can circumvent local zoning. Next slide. That includes environmental also. Like they can't just build on like protected land, you know, they can't do that. So more on 40B, it allows for eligible affordable housing developments to receive that comprehensive permit that was mentioned, which requires waivers from the ZBA. So there are two terms that people are usually familiar with. So there's a friendly 40B and an unfriendly 40B. Unless anyone wants to take a guess at what those are, I'm happy to tell you what they are.
5 Granite Street, the town supported. That's your outfit. That was a friendly 40B.
A certain percentage of the units are earmarked for affordability as well as non-affordability.
Close. Close. So basically, okay, so developments can include market rate and affordable. Granite Street happens to be 100% affordable. But a developer could come and do 100 units and do 10 affordable, and that would be eligible. A friendly 40B is usually when a municipality is at the 10%, right? They can choose to approve a 40B application voluntarily, and it's called friendly 40B because you have more control of what you're allowing the developer to create because you're at the 10%. The unfriendly 40B is when you are below the 10% and you have less control over what that developer can do because they have more wiggle room, waiver-wise and zoning-wise, to develop because that 10% has not been achieved.
Do you happen to know that the 10% is a factor of the existing housing in the town? And do you happen to know what Rockport's numbers are?
Yes, we will get to that.
3400.
So safe harbor status, that's something else you might have heard. So this is like a temporary designation that a municipality can receive if they have an approved housing production plan and are showing progress towards meeting that 10%. So that progress is defined as 0.5% per year towards their goal. So if their goal is 100 housing units, 25. I'm sorry, not 25. Told you it wasn't my strong suit. 5. Was that right? Yep. Yes, thank you. 5% is 5 units of 100, right? They also extend safe harbor status to towns below the 10%. So you can try to have a little bit more influence in what's developed with a housing production plan, so long as you are showing progress towards that housing goal. Next slide. Subsidized housing inventory and where Rockport's numbers are. So the SHI is the state's measurement of what percentage of housing stock is low or moderate income in a community. This is what 40B uses. So 40B will look at the number of SHI percentage and determine whether you're above or below. and whether 40B is available in your municipality. So one of the things I want to mention is that seasonal or occasional use units, as defined by DHCD, which is the Department of Housing and Community Development, the state government agency that oversees housing, are not included in SHI.
Would it follow from that that the additional dwelling units, 6 months, would not be counted?
Maybe. I want to talk about that. Maybe. Depends on what the ordinance, the final version says. If it allows for like Airbnb, for example, they would not count. It also has to be affordable to be on the SHI. Has to be at 80% or below. Next slide. So Rockport. So these numbers are just what's there now, right? So as of December 21st, 2020, Rockport had 3,460 units, with 135 of those registered on the SHI, or 3.9%. There is new data that is waiting to be released. It's going to be released in April, April 27th. The Census Bureau scheduled the release for May of 2023. So Granite Street Crossing, which I think somebody asked about, will increase Rockport's SHI, but it's not included here because to have your SHI number change, number one, the units have to be completed, leased up, occupancy permits, everything has to be cleared, and two, they have to be registered. So government or the developer can submit the application to DHCD. And the application's online. If you're curious, it's literally like a page and a half. It basically asks for like the address, the income level, a couple other things about the development. And so if all the units at Granite Street are registered and approved, it would hypothetically take Rockport from 3.9 to 4.7. We good? Any questions on that? Yeah.
Questions after?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'd still be short roughly 175 to 200 homes.
You still have a good little chunk there.
Can I ask one other question? Because this is
I think we're-
dangling
we're
against
done.
the 10% requirement.
Say that again?
This is in recognition of the 10% requirement. And then there's in terms of the transit overlay and other concepts that we're considering for that, of which it was paired with some form of restrained funding in the future, if you don't do this,
The compliance?
right?
Yep.
What exists today when a community doesn't meet the 10% obligation?
Excuse me, sir, if we're in the Q&A, if people could just ask a question, announce your name and address, please?
Sure.
And then,
And I don't
You
even
don't
mind
need
waiting
me to
until at the
interview,
end,
do
if
you?
that's what you
Okay.
want.
Unless you want to.
no, I don't want to necessarily, but I want to go back and forth
Yeah.
with Tom,
People online, yeah.
with the people online. But thank you, sir. If you could identify yourself. And then we'll be passing around index cards. So if you don't get to ask your question by 12:15, write it on the index card, and it will be part of the panel on March 11th.
115?
1:15, yep.
Should we just wait? I don't have any problem.
No,
you
honest, I
started.
was at the end, so
Yeah.
no. So you're so
Jim
I'm just gonna
Ugoni of
restate your
30
question.
Jim Ugoni of 33 Main Street. And I was
See you,
just
Jim.
questioning the relationship between the current rules regarding the 10% minimum as a factor against the total housing available
Yeah.
in the town as it stands, and the connections to, I don't want to use the word penalty or considerations,
Yeah.
I'll call them.
Yeah, considerations. good.
Right, what are those when you
Yeah.
don't meet your 10% versus what you mentioned earlier about what
The
happens?
MBTA. Yeah, that's a really good question. So, couple things. Remember that the MBTA law does not require affordability. So we're not talking exactly about the same thing, but I'm happy to go there because it's something that we talk about all the time. What did you say, considerations if someone's under 10%? So the short answer is nothing really other than 40B. That's it. with CPA funds, right, you have an obligation to disperse the money to the 3 buckets, but that's about it. So how you spend those monies and when is kind of up to you as a municipality, right, or as a CPA committee. The MBTA, like you said, the consequence of not being in compliance, which Rockport, I believe, as a commuter rail has until January of 2024 to submit their final plan for approval to DHCD. The consequence of that is loss of state funding, potentially. So does that answer your question? So kind of not the same, but the answer is nothing really, other than 40B.
Tom, someone on Zoom?
Oh, sorry.
I don't see anyone.
Oh, that's Kate. Hi, Kate. She asked for a copy of the presentation. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I can get you that. Yep. I think that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, so I have 2 questions. You said that
Identify yourself, please.
Z. Sapola, you said that in the course of building these affordable housing units, there's projected to be for 80% of the median income is determined by HUD, but Rockport can build up to 110%. I'm not quite sure what you're meaning. I'm thinking that, okay, you're going to build these places, and if somebody qualifies at 80% of the HUD income, they can get into the place. But you can actually, what's the 110%? How does that figure into it?
no, I'm glad you asked that because it's really confusing. Tom, would you be able to pull the PowerPoint back up? Do you mind? I just want to show the HUD limits. So that's like towards, I don't know, maybe slide 6, around there. Okay, right there.
This one.
Yep, thank you. So 110 is not on here, go figure. So there's 100 and 120, right? So let's go with one person. So to create a unit that is eligible to be registered as affordable and count towards Rockport's 10% requirement, you have to rent it for one person. 78,300 is the income limit. So you have to rent it to somebody that makes 78,300
Have it
whatever.
count.
Or below that, yes. To have it count. And you can do that through a variety of ways, but I'll use the example
But you
I'm most
can
familiar
rent it
with.
to higher income people.
Not
let's
if you
say.
want it to, well,
If you don't care about it counting. Is that what you're saying?
depends. So can I give an example about Granite Street or Rockport
Yeah,
High
sure.
School? Okay.
The whole
So
purpose of
our
having it,
properties, for example,
so it does
right?
count.
They're subsidized.
What's he
Meaning
talking about?
there is a voucher in place within the development. So it doesn't matter if you move in and then you move out and then I move in and then I move out. The third person coming along is still going to have to meet this requirement because the subsidy is within the apartment itself.
Gee,
So they
no
would still
problem
have to
there.
qualify at 80% because it's subsidized. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So the 110%, as a developer, you could, not us in particular, because we only do affordable housing, but if we were a developer that did market rate and affordable housing, we could do a portion at above 100%. So we could have, I don't know where it went.
Hands off.
Okay, well, we
It's a
could.
touchscreen, by the way.
Oh, I touched it.
I
I'm
know.
sorry. I didn't know it was a touch screen. We could rent it.
There you go.
We could rent it to someone that makes over $98,000 a year if we wanted to. But that would not count towards Rockport's 10% requirement and would not be eligible on the SHI. Yes.
This is another question. Is that okay? Are you ready?
Oh.
Real quick.
Hold on.
Yeah, real quick.
Yeah.
You said that Rockport has a bylaw, which it does, that has an affordable housing trust composed of 9 people. I think it's 5 town officials and 4 residents, or 4
I think
town,
it's 5 residents.
5 residents.
Five minimum.
There's an action going on now by the town government bylaw committee to make that committee 5 people before it's ever even had a chance to come into existence. And the rationale is that they believe a 9-member committee will be unwieldy, in the words of the chair of the bylaw committee. So do you have experience working with these affordable housing trust people or communities? And can you comment on whether or not a 9-person board is indeed unwieldy, or whether or not that it really is a good idea to have people that know something about housing on these boards?
So what I will say is the state statute is 5 minimum. So you can elect to have 9 or 10, but you have to have at least 5. Our experience with affordable housing trusts in general are twofold, right? One is we have conversations like this or trainings about a specific topic with people that serve on housing board trusts in different communities, along with, ZBA and a couple other housing related committees or boards. And number 2, experience requesting and securing funds from affordable housing trust funds to build our developments. Me personally, I have nothing to do with the financing or the development. Granite Street would not be up if it was up to me. I'm more on the other side where, I do community conversations and whatever, so I can't really tell you whether it would be unwieldy or not.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
I have a question. Laura Evans, 77 High Street. If I decide to put an ADU in my house, and then I rent it to somebody and comply with the affordable housing, I rent it for the 80%, would that add to the 10% requirement for the town? In other words, is there an organic way for us to meet that 10% that does not necessarily involve development of anything, new development?
That's a good question. So yes and no, depending. So what communities, I know, I'm sorry, I'm going to say that a lot. So what other communities have done, as an example, for ADUs, and there's various levels. So sometimes people have basements that are like in-law apartments, or you have a detached, garage that's been turned into like a little studio or whatever. What some communities have done is they have allowed for people to access certain incentives to rent them at an affordable rate. So I'll give you an example. You could get a tax break. This is not Rockport, I'm just saying generally speaking. You could get a tax break if you register an ADU, assuming you have an ADU ordinance. Does everybody know what we're talking about when we say ADUs? Okay, I figured, but you have to have an ordinance in place first that says an ADU must be rented at 80% or below.
Throughout the town, or
The town.
case by case?
The town. Because somebody has to check it, right? You have to have certificate of occupancy, all of that stuff. It has to go through the town and be registered with the town as a rental property. And then, once that's rented, if it's at the 80%, that could count. So, if you don't do it that way, it might not. So, like, if I, out of the goodness of my heart, start renting out my basement at 60% AMI, that's what you would call, like, naturally occurring housing, right? Where I'm doing it, and it's because I want to, but I can't go to the state and say, hey, I live in Rockport, and, I have a 60% apartment because, hypothetically, they add it, and then I kick the person out, and then I charge 110%, right, of the market rate. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It does, but I mean, it has to be either all or nothing in
Kind
the
of.
whole town?
Kind of, yeah. So there are different mechanisms that can make an ADU really work towards hitting that number. and you can also diversify like the housing stock and the options that way. So you're creating, more opportunities. A lot of the times when people talk about ADUs being affordable, this is the big A, the little a slide that I had in there that I took out. So the big A affordable is when it's what we discussed earlier, like subsidized 30% of someone's income. The little a affordable is like, it's affordable to me because I make this income and I live here. Or because I'm renting an ADU and because it's smaller in size, the rent is less. So you can have naturally occurring affordable housing through ADUs because of their smaller size. But if you're after the 10%, it requires some more concrete stuff in place. I think you've had your hand up for a while.
Some
You can
rentals
be next.
are including utilities and some.
yourself?
Oh, sorry, Jonathan Strong from
What did I miss?
Henderson Court.
Talking about
Some rentals
ADUs.
include utilities and some
AD
don't.
what?
So how do you work
ADUs,
that with the 30% of it?
Additional dwelling units.
I believe it has to include utilities
It has to,
for a rental property.
and Section 8 housing is part of the,
Section 8 is a voucher program, subsidized program.
and that's included in the percentage of Rockport.
Yes.
affordable.
Yes. But the difference is the Section 8 voucher follows the person, right?
Right.
So like I could rent, if you had an apartment in your house, I could rent the apartment from you using my voucher. So you'd have to be, registered and able to accept the
So it's
voucher.
the renter rather than the facility.
Correct. Not like the other example where I said, the third person would get the same.
But it
rent.
still counts as part of the percentage of affordable housing?
No.
No.
No, because it's not the property, it's
I
the
see.
person. Because I could leave Rockport
Yeah.
and take it somewhere else, right? Take my voucher with me, hypothetically.
Yeah, Eric Hutchins, 45 Pools Lane, kind of an on-the-ground Rockport applicability question.
All right, I'll try.
And this is something that's been raised at so many meetings, you probably heard it too. We, doesn't matter what town, we have to reach the 10%. You hear that? There's a requirement. We have to reach the 10%. So my two questions that are very much combined on that, and correct me if my math is wrong on this, just laying it out. With Rockport right now, if all of our future development was through 40Bs, and no other development, private development, 100% 40Bs, we would need to build approximately 1,500 housing units in Rockport to reach the 10%.
Affordable.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So we would have.
And
to
I told you math is not my strong suit,
1,500
but
housing where 10% were affordable, and that gives you the 150.
you have to no. So the 10% is calculated off your total housing stock,
Yeah.
right? So is that what you were saying? Sorry.
Yes. No, we're already at 3.9, you said. We're about to be 4, call it 5. We're about to be 5, thanks to you guys. Which means, as Jim said, we need about 150 more to reach 10%. We need Rockport to meet the 10%, needs about 150 more units.
200.
Okay, whatever. Well, either way, 150 to 200.
But the difference I want to highlight is that Granite Street is 100% affordable.
I realize that.
So if I came in and I submitted a 40B application and I was proposing 200 units, only 10% of those have to be affordable. So the 200 would get added to the total housing stock, right, and then you get to the 10%.
So part of my realism question is, I mean, and this is why I bring this up, just as devil's advocate, is there any scenario of Rockport reaching 10% realistically in even 50 years? I mean, I'm not being sarcastic.
Yeah.
I'm being realistic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a city planner, but I think you could. If you reach, I mean, it's a lot of development in a short amount of time, but if you have things like TOVD and MBTA that allows for multifamily by right, you reach those units a lot quicker than if you're building like single family homes, for example, right? So you could, but it's a really aggressive plan, and you have to find all developers that are going to, follow all those timelines for those units that you're after. Does that make sense?
The reason I bring it up, I contend we cannot, we probably won't. We should, a goal, but realistically as a municipality, it is probably beyond reach for us to reach the 10%. We should try. We should do everything we can, but realistically,
Yeah,
it ain't gonna happen in Rockport.
I can't tell you whether or not, because I'm not a planner.
Right.
But
Not in my backyard.
yeah, but the other thing is, like we talked about earlier, right? If you adopt a housing production plan, it does lay out a vision. Oftentimes, it's not, we're gonna build that many units in this amount of time, like that short amount of time. But if you're making progress towards it, I think it shows good faith that you're committed to that goal as a town, and you're making progress towards
I have a
that
question
goal.
on Zoom.
Hi, my name's Beth Shapiro. I live on Stockholm Ave. I guess to Eric's point, as we're, if we're looking at strategies for getting to the 10%, the thing that worries me about looking just at transit-oriented housing is the problem with the trains sitting and idling there, and that's how, environmental justice issues come into play, is that low-income people get stuck in the worst places in town to live, where they have things like pollution and noise from a train right outside their door. And is that the kind of place Rockport wants to be? I know that's not, the main point of this meeting, but it does seem unattainable.
Yeah, I mean, I can appreciate that sentiment, Beth. I agree. And I think there's a lot of studies that show, right, where what kinds of things exist or get built in traditionally low-income communities. But I do want to highlight, what we talked about today with TOVD and MBTA. Those are things that are proposed in Rockport, one of them being a state law, right, that everyone has to comply with, which is the MBTA one, that every MBTA community has to comply with. And the other thing would be that it doesn't, again, have to be all affordable housing. It can be market rate. We obviously want to encourage affordable housing as much as possible at the highest percentage as possible, but it can be market rate and moderate or low income housing households.
Thank you.
Rosa, as I
I'm sorry,
understand
I thought
it, the first task of the Affordable Housing Trust that the Select Board just voted to enact is that housing production plan, to hire a planner to create that, for whatever that contributes to the conversation.
Oh, that's good. That's great. Is there an RFP out yet?
Sounds to me
I don't know the answer to that. Is there any select person here?
before we have the choice
There we
of
go.
moving it.
Is there an RFP out? I believe there's an RFP out. It's been
Before
out.
you have
Can you
what?
identify
the
yourself?
choice
Yes,
of
current
moving
ledger.
into a place.
This week.
Motion legend. Yes, there's an
What do you mean?
RFP out, but we don't have.
They're
what we
building
want
one
yet.
now.
The
Yeah,
standpoint
but
of
how?
response.
Yeah, but
Can you speak
But-
up,
Anyway,
please?
to
Okay, I'll speak up.
units.
I'll also speak
do you
up
mean
to the other issue with regard
MBTA
to,
will,
to
yeah.
the transportation development area around the train station. I think you have to use your imaginations as opposed to sitting in the present time. As has been said by others, at a point in time, there will be electric trains to Rockport. Okay, number one. Number two, from my point of view, I would move the trains away from Railroad Avenue and stop them at Pools Lane. Admittedly, it's a fight. It's going through a well field. You can say whatever you want in response to it, but the fact remains is that if you want to move the trains away from people, then move the trains away from people. There is also the possibility that there are huts that could be purchased to cover the train. That's a possibility. Relocation of train storage at night, that's a possibility. So use your imaginations as you think of the future. Don't just think of what is currently the situation.
Another question on Zoom? Jenny?
Hi, Jenny Amory, Andrews Hollow. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. And I was intrigued by Eric's question, and I wanted to just propose a different scenario just to see if this made sense. If if you were to build another 5 or 6, let's say, affordable housing units like the one that's on Granite Street, in other words, all affordable, would that reach a help anywhere in town, let's say anywhere in Rockport, would that help Rockport to reach the 10%?
Thank you for the question, Jenny. And as long as it follows the parameters we talked about earlier, it would, right? So as long as it's 80% or below, it would. What I would mention about Granite Street Crossing is that it's very difficult to build. What makes it difficult to build is the size, the different financing mechanisms you have to draw from. And as you probably all know, the rising costs of construction and materials, right, and labor. So that is typically why developers have a harder time creating something that's smaller in size, like Granite Street Crossing. We started that in 2017. If we tried to do that now, it probably wouldn't work. So it's tough to build, 5 or 6 of those now. The other thing would be the zoning would have to allow for it, right? So when you say anywhere in Rockport, I love that, that you're thinking that way, but the zoning has to be compatible for that type of development, meaning it has to allow multifamily zoning or a special permit or a 40B or something has to be used if it's not allowable by right.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. All right, I'm gonna let you pick next person
there's,
because I haven't been keeping
in
track
the
of
back?
whose hand went when.
There's one in the back, I don't think he's taking.
Jay Reed, 3 Canterbury Lane. I believe the CPC grants money to Action Incorporated in Gloucester for their rental assistance program.
Yep.
Those monies that go to helping rental assistance in Rockport, that adds to the subsidized housing inventory?
No.
Why?
So it's allowable. CPA funds have their own rules that they have to follow, right? It's an allowable use of that money to help low-income families financially, but it does not do anything as far as your SHI number. So the SHI registry, right, is when the town has an apartment that is rented at 80% AMI or below and is registered with the state. So like if that family is living in one of those, that unit's good. You want people to pay their rent, right? You want people to stay housed, which is part of why it's an allowable use, because it is helping a family that needs it. But it wouldn't, like if it wasn't a registered unit and financial assistance went to that person because, I don't know, they had some life-changing event and now they're, below the 80% AMI, which I think is what you were getting at. Like if they are under 80% AMI, it doesn't automatically qualify that unit they're living in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Jim Ugoni again, 33 Main Street. The complexity of this is incredible. I mean, there's so many factors,
Yeah.
wheels turning and all of this. It's really quite amazing, and you're really knowledgeable, and I appreciate you taking the time to come here. Very quickly, ultimately, our choices in which, this is a beautiful list for help us with the vocabulary.
It's very long. Read it at night when you're trying to go to sleep.
There's a lot of terms in here.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it sounds like there's between 5 and 8 forms of way you can bring affordable housing into a town. That would be a nice separate sheet for the next workshop.
How to do it?
Section 8 versus. But my question to you is in the narrative of affordability.
Yep.
Is that what I'm observing in terms of both professionally and my neighbors and my family is the definition in who needs affordable housing. And we have a need in this town for younger folks who may have very low financial capital, but they have their whole life before them to work, and you can present value that future earnings and it's known as human capital. So they're very low in financial capital, but they have very high human capital. And they're on a mission to perhaps build financial capital and need help in transition until they can afford either singularly or in joint fashion with the spouse or partner to be able to buy a home. Conversely, on the other spectrum of retirement, old age, and really old age, there are three different functions of which we have people who have not been able to achieve or accumulate financial capital, and they live on fixed income, Social Security, small pensions, or otherwise. But they meet all the standards necessary for affordability from a financial metric. But building these places that accommodates the needs of these completely different interest groups must be really challenging, because one is a bridge to buy a house, for example, and we have many people in town who want to help kids get a home or get out with, I think, what you can call home formation, get out of the house and they can live somewhere until then. But also the location, for example, in the MBTA area for someone who is aged is very interesting, because it's very likely that they may not be going into Boston or going to a job in Beverly, or for whatever reason this transit access is, or even walking into town without great help at certain ages.
Sure.
So how do you factor all of this when you are making decisions with either Harbor Light or the high school apartments, et cetera?
Woo! How much time do we have left?
You have 60 seconds.
So that's a lot there, and I appreciate that there's a lot of different ways I can go with this. Okay, so yes, it's very complex and very difficult. Granite Street Crossing, despite its smaller size, does that, right? It offers family housing and also senior housing. My other the other hat that I wear at Harbor Light is resident services. So I'll share with you that right now we're looking at that property and thinking, how do we support two completely opposite populations, right? How do we try to create this like intergenerational harmony between, you know, everybody that lives there, and also make sure that they have access to what they need at different levels. So for our senior population, a lot of the times what we do is like we'll partner with other organizations or government programs that provide things like medical or nursing care or transportation that you don't want us doing. Like, you don't want me checking in on your grandmother or your great-grandmother. But, like, you know, we can work with those agencies. Our staff can make sure that seniors are on the right plan, and if they're not, help them enroll in the right plan that will allow them access to things like transportation and medical care, for example. As far as like proximity of where to build, you know, younger people are a little easier to, they can figure out how to get somewhere, right? They can take an Uber, they can skateboard, they can do whatever if they're not, like you said, what did you say, the old or the super old? They can get around more, right? So we worry less about that, but I forget the name of the person that spoke earlier about the location of the housing.
Jenny.
That's
Jenny?
yeah, like what Jenny said, right? That's really important as we're considering development. To us, any development is good development because we want to provide affordable homes, but the location makes it difficult. So we would like to see locations that are closer to like the town center, because that's where people go, right? When you need to go buy groceries or you want to go out to eat or get a coffee or whatever, that's probably where you're going. If you don't have a car or you don't drive anymore, it's harder to get to groceries or get a coffee if you have to go, 3 miles to get there. Forgot what other things you mentioned.
Just the complexities in everything, aging and staging and location.
Our goal, is always for people, for senior development, for people to age in place, right? Which is part of why, the services are really important to us, because we want people to be able to age in place and stay where they are.
So, Edith Jacobs on Jewett Street. So this has come up all over the country, but what about Rockport, where it really is a food desert in terms of that we don't have any grocery stores? So when you talk
there's the ones that when you come in, right?
Transportation,
Shaws and,
or being able to walk to services in a town, like groceries, we don't have that.
Right.
So I don't know how that gets factored in.
Well, I think, as your Board of Selectmen here mentioned, you have to think about where you want to be in the future, right? So that's kind of the concept behind something like TOVD, is you think about what is missing from the town center, what is missing from where people are living. And if groceries is one of those things, a lot of the ways you can do that is you can allow mixed use, where you have commercial on the first floor and then you have housing above it, or you increase the zoning to allow for more density in an area, right? And then you start to build out the businesses around it. Rockport is beautiful and unique to itself, so I hesitate to even bring up anybody else. But like, if you look at other town centers, some of them have those things and some of them don't. Even a place like Salem that is very dense downtown and allows a lot of different development, one of the largest complaints is that there's not a grocery store there. Like, there's a Steve's, which is like, like, it depends on if you feel like playing Russian roulette with the meat that day. Like, it depends if you really are hungry and you want to go there. Like, I'm probably not going there. But, you know, if I need like a box of pasta, I can go there, right? If I live downtown, which I don't. But anyway, I don't want to go on a tangent. But I would say, like, you have to consider the development and the zoning for the future to include all of those things, because that is how you allow people to kind of age in place and get around, you know, safely.
Toby Arsenian, 95 Granite Street. We have in the zoning code a section called housing balance,
Okay.
Which is our feeble and attempt at getting some affordable housing. But that only applies in cases of special permits. That section is one of the ones that was supposed to be on the agenda for the last town meeting and got pushed forward to the next one, the annual town meeting. In there is a stipulation, it only applies to housing by special permit. So anything you got out of that conflicts with what the state is asking for, which is housing by right, okay? So,
Are they in the same area?
pardon?
Are they in the same geographical area?
The housing balance isn't in terms of areas, it's just in terms of developments
Okay.
over a certain number of units. You're
Got it.
supposed to supply a proportion of affordable housing,
Mm-hmm.
but only for ones that are done by special permit.
Got it.
So that directly conflicts with what the state is asking for in the transportation-oriented development area. It's designed basically to clash and not work. And I would just comment on the state standards for affordable housing. 80% of the median income over a given area skews it very high in terms of the income. If you were being honest about it and talking about people who held entry-level jobs,
Yep.
doing drudgery and getting by,
Yep.
$15 an hour times 40 hours a week times 50 weeks a year gives you an income of $30,000, and there would
Yep.
not be anything that you would be able to afford by the state's quote-unquote affordable definition. So that's a basic disconnect and dishonesty right at the beginning.
So a couple things. Having not read the wording of the zoning, the housing balance portion you're talking about, my initial thought is that it would clash with the MBTA district only in that district, right? It would have to be overridden or removed from the MBTA area because, like you said, no special permits, right? They have to be allowed by right. But it could remain in place, I believe, the rest of the town. It's just within that designated MBTA district, the special permits are not allowed.
The MBTA district is an overlay district, which is another strange feature of it. It left the underlying zoning as an alternative for anyone having
Correct.
property there who wanted it. So,
Yeah, it's basically an overlay, except that it doesn't a traditional overlay like a 40R or something like that like lies on top of the existing zoning. The MBTA would kind of like override any of that zoning.
no, I believe it left, the intent was, but I don't know about the legalities, was to leave both in place, so that those who own property there had the resource
Oh,
of whatever
homeownership.
they had before, and this was an alternative for somebody who wanted to come in and do a large-scale development.
I see.
3 minutes.
There are municipalities that are very close to already achieving compliance. So they wouldn't necessarily need somebody to come in and do a large development, and those are like, you know, places that have more high density downtown areas. So they are able to suggest an overlay to reach the compliance and then submit their application and see if they've met it. So it depends on the municipality's, you know, what your current housing looks like in your current area.
One other question. Are there any small towns our size that have met the 10% requirement?
In all of Massachusetts?
Yes.
I don't know. There's a lot of.
Good question.
It's
It should
100
be answered,
before?
it should be answered.
Okay.
And Provincetown is one of them.
Okay. Wow.
Provincetown.
I want to thank you. I want to comment on one thing you said, the 80%. Remember that that's the requirement. You can go below that. So, for example, you could have developments that are at 60% or 30%, which is really appropriate for a lot of like people on fixed incomes that are retired or are on SSDI or whatever, right? That would qualify for SHI. 80 is the minimum. You can go well below that if you choose to, as a developer. And what you said about it not being affordable to anyone, that's the little a. Agree with you. I had a slide in here about what it means for like people that are working, like cashiers or nursing assistants, EMTs, cooks, right? And you're right, it's between like $15 and $18 an hour-ish. So that comes out to like $29,000 to $36,000. Those are the people that are going to need those deeper affordability levels of 30% AMI, for example. In Rockport, right, I believe last summer was really challenging in terms of restaurants having enough people to be able to open their normal hours or their normal days. That is a consequence, I think, that I was like, do I say consideration or consequence? That we see a lot, that like, you know, we're seeing a lot everywhere. Like, we're all seeing it. Even places like down on the Cape have a really hard time having enough workers because there's nowhere for them to live. They can't afford to live there. And I'm thinking about like how cold it was, right? Like last night and all the ice, like I was scared to just get to my car. If I had to drive 30 minutes as a nursing assistant or a home care provider, like to do my job, I don't know that I would have wanted to do that when it was iced over and cold, right? So that's another reason why I think we have to think about the affordability. And even though the 80% is the minimum, who do you want to be able to live, you know, in close proximity to you?
Can we do one more on Zoom with Ross Brackett here?
Sure.
All right, thank you. Ross Brackett, 29 Main Street. My question was, when you say state funding, is it actual state funding or is it access to state grants? Because I haven't seen anything that would refer to us losing actual state funding, but I have seen that we lose access to state grants. So I was just curious if
You're
it's one or
referring
the
to
other or both.
You're referring to the MBTA compliance?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was specific funding streams, like MassWorks is one of them, for example.
All righty, thank you.
No, you're welcome.
And Mr. Lilia had a question?
No, I have actually a statement. Senator Tar sponsored a program this past summer which brought several hundred worker age, college age, medical school age students from Europe to the eastern Massachusetts section. Several hundred were down on Cape Cod. We had, I think, 35 here on Cape Ann that supported the restaurants. And that program will continue. And they managed to find housing for those students during the course of the summer, or did this past year. I suspect they will in the future.
Yeah.
So there is an approach to finding the necessary labor for the restaurants to open, both on Cape Cod and on Cape Ann.
Okay.
Well, thank you,
you.
Rosa Ordaz. I think this
Yeah.
was really, really informative.
We could be here for another hour.
Yeah, and thank everybody, thank you so much for coming out. On your way out, we do have a affordable housing primer, which our Rockport citizen Ken Kaiser wrote. It's 3 pages, and it's a really good summary. And we have sign-up sheets if you want to volunteer to help educate the populace before the town meeting. There's a sign-up sheet out there. Barbara, you want to say something?
Well, I just want to say that we call ourselves the Rockport Affordable Housing Coalition, and we are who brought this program, and Ms. Ortiz, thank you so much, to you today. And our goal is just inform, so that when people get to town meeting, they know what they're voting on. So we're thankful if you signed in and put your email if you want us to keep in touch in any way. If you didn't, because some people came in late, please do. And please take one of these because Ken did a beautiful job on supporting some of the information for Rockport that Ms. Ortiz presented. And we thank you very much all for coming out today to listen to us.
And the next thing I know of, I believe, is the 9th, where the planning board will have a session at Town Hall. I don't know when. I don't think it's posted yet. And then the Rockport Affordable Housing Coalition will have a panel discussion on March 11th here at high noon, and presenters TBA. But there, I think we can get more into the discussion. And thanks so much for surrendering part of your Saturday. Yeah.